as opposed to all those other forms of Nazism that are not a problem?
Yes, they did. In 1935, the Times cast Hitler as a moderate, passing the Nuremberg laws to appease the radical wing of the Nazi Party.
The problem is that you can have an imam in an ordinary mosque in Orlando right before this attack preaching the murder of gays.
Death is the sentence. I mean, look, there's nothing to be embarrassed about this. That death is the sentence. But we have to have that compassion for people. With homosexuals, the same. Out of compassion, let's get rid of him now.
All of this talk about guns is a combination of pure confusion on the part of people who don't know anything about guns and dishonest political posturing on the part of those who do. The rest is pure obfuscation about the real issue, which is an all too literal interpretation of the doctrine of Islam that is spreading the world over and which liberals are lying about and branding all reasonable concerns about this issue to be symptoms of racism and xenophobia and bigotry. I mean, here's an easy way to see how outrageously off the mark much of this discussion is, and really everything the president has said in the aftermath of Orlando is. If this shooter had used pressure cooker bombs of the sort used in the Boston Marathon attack, nothing the president said in his first speech would have made any sense at all. That's a problem. That reveals either genuine confusion or well-rehearsed obscurantism about the issue. It is a terrible problem that, in addition to all of the stupid things he has said in response, only Trump has expressed moral clarity on this issue. And he did it in the following sentence in his speech. He said, "America must unite the whole civilized world in the fight against Islamic terrorism." America must unite the whole civilized world in the fight against Islamic terrorism. Why can't Hillary Clinton or President Obama say that? That is an enormous problem that they can't say it. Now, when I took to Twitter and I urged Hillary to speak clearly on this topic, I got attacked by even LGBT activists for my bigotry, for inspiring hate against Muslims. Okay, that this is how confused the left is. Just a few hours after this news broke, LGBT activists were so allergic to having someone name the belief system that had just produced a massacre in their community that they lashed out against me as a bigot, rather than lash out against the people who won't name the belief system that, at this moment, is doing more than any other on earth to target gays and to force them into hiding. I mean, the left is so confused on this topic. I honestly think that it would be possible to find someone in an orange jumpsuit about to get his head cut off who, with his last words, would complain about Islamophobia. I mean, literally a bad right-wing cartoon is possible in the real world now, given the moral confusion we're dealing with. And the confusion is the direct result of the words we use. And much of this confusion has been consciously engineered by obscurantists. A word like Islamophobia was invented to spread confusion. And now we have a president and a press who use it completely unselfconsciously. Now, the president just gave a speech. It ended like 5 minutes ago, pushing back against this complaint about his not honestly naming the problem to be radical Islam. And Hillary Clinton has done the same thing. She's reluctantly talked in the last few days about radical Islamism and radical jihadism. She said, fine, I'll say it, radical Islamism, radical jihadism, but it doesn't matter what you call it, it matters what you do. And the president took the same line in his speech. And they both claim that anyone who cares about the words we use here is just engaged in a semantic game and empty politicking. This really is infuriatingly dishonest. If it matters that you think clearly about a problem, if it matters that you understand what the problem is, then the words you use matter, because we think and understand with concepts. Take Hillary's recent utterances: radical jihadism, radical Islamism. Does she think there is a non-radical form of Islamism or jihadism? Does she think that? Either she's confused, or in yet another tortured instance of political correctness, she's trying to do anything she can to avoid saying the word Islam. This isn't semantics. This matters. Would someone talk about radical Nazism being a problem, as opposed to all those other forms of Nazism that are not a problem? Okay. And the president in his speech was, again, this is a very difficult thing to criticize, because 99% of smart people who watched that speech, who are not well attuned to this issue, will think he was brilliant. He held the moral high ground. He smashed the demagogue, xenophobe, racist Trump, right? Here's finally there's a grown-up who's talking sense. And you should watch Obama's speech that he gave today, Tuesday. This, I think, is his second speech in response to Orlando. He's obviously a much better speaker than Trump is, but his speech was incredibly dishonest and sanctimonious and bullying, frankly. He said that ISIS, he won't call them ISIS, he calls them ISIL, they're not religious. They're perverting a great religion. They're distorting a great religion. I understand why someone may think it's pragmatic to talk that way, but if in fact we need to talk that way, otherwise we're going to produce millions of radicals who think that their religion needs to be defended against the West, that is a statement of a terrifying problem that we need to be thinking about clearly. But otherwise, this is just a lie. The problem is deeper than that. The problem is an all too plausible interpretation of Islam, the great religion, is yielding this behavior for reasons that are not in the least bit mysterious. The problem is that you can have an imam in an ordinary mosque in Orlando right before this attack preaching the murder of gays, which in fact happened, right? This video is now circulating. And you lie about this reality at your peril. Politically, yes, but in every other way. But to continue to obfuscate this issue is simply preparing the ground for ISIS to have a vote in our presidential election. It matters that this is the sort of thing Hillary emphasizes in the immediate aftermath of Orlando. Rather than talk about jihad or Islamism, she says things like this: inflammatory anti-Muslim rhetoric hurts the vast majority of Muslims who love freedom and hate terror. It's no coincidence that hate crimes against American Muslims and mosques tripled after Paris and San Bernardino. Islamophobia goes against everything we stand for as a nation, founded on freedom of religion, and it plays right into the terrorists' hands. This is something she can talk about, right? But if you dig into these sentences, you just find moral confusion, half-truths, and lies. Okay, great. Hate crimes against American Muslims tripled after Paris and San Bernardino? Well, if they tripled, they are still less than hate crimes against Jews in America, which scarcely occur. And they're almost all property crimes. And many of these hate crimes against Muslims, things that are getting categorized as hate crimes against Muslims, are getting categorized by groups like CARE that are just making up hate crimes when these are ordinary crimes. She uses the phrase, the word Islamophobia, without any problem, right? A term of propaganda meant to stifle a conversation about the need for reform within Islam. Okay, Islam has a problem that we have to talk about. And the word Islamophobia is thrown up to stop that conversation. A phobia is an irrational fear. Is it irrational to be worried more about Islam at this moment than about Mormonism. And then this final claim that it plays right into the terrorist's hands. This is the narrative that I've talked about on the podcast. The idea that if we focus on Islam in any overt way, we will drive more Muslims into the hands of the theocrats, right? More Muslims will support a group like ISIS than would have otherwise if we speak honestly about the ideology that is delivering us this mayhem, right? Well, if true, that is so terrifying that we should talk about almost nothing else in this area, right? And if not true, it is the most paranoid and uncharitable thing ever said about a community. I'll tell you what harms the vast majority of Muslims that love freedom and hate terror. Muslim theocracy does. Muslim intolerance does. Wahhabism does. Salafism does. Islamism does. Jihadism does. Sharia law does. The mere conservatism of traditional Islam does. Okay, we're not talking about only jihadists hating homosexuals or thinking they should die. We're talking about conservative Muslims. The percentage of British Muslims polled who said that homosexuality was morally acceptable was 0. Do you realize what it takes to say something so controversial in a poll that not even 1% of those polled would agree with it? There's almost no question that extreme that you will ever see in a poll that gets a 0. But ask British Muslims whether homosexuality is morally acceptable, and that's what you get. And the result is more or less the same in dozens of other countries. It's 0 in Cameroon, 0 in Ethiopia, 1% in Nigeria, 1% in Tanzania, 1% in Mali, 2% in Kenya, 2% in Chad, 1% in Lebanon, 1% in Egypt, 1% in the Palestinian territories, 1% in Iraq, 2% in Jordan, 2% in Tunisia, 1% in Pakistan, but 10% in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, that bright spot in the Muslim world where they are regularly hunting down and butchering secular writers with machetes. The people who suffer under this belief system are Muslims themselves, the next generation of human beings born into a Muslim community who could otherwise have been liberal, tolerant, well-educated, cosmopolitan, productive people, are, to one or another degree, being taught to aspire to live in the Middle Ages, or to ruin this world en route to some fictional paradise after death. That's the thing we have to get our heads around. And yes, some of what I just said applies with varying modifications to other religions and other cults, but there is nothing like Islam at this moment for generating this kind of intolerance and chaos. And if only a right-wing demagogue will speak honestly about it, then we will elect right-wing demagogues in the West more and more in response to it. And that will be the price of political correctness. That's when this check will finally get cashed. That will be the consequence of this persistent failure we see among liberals to speak and think and act with real moral clarity and courage on this issue. The root of this problem is that liberals consistently fail to defend liberal values as universal human values. Their political correctness, their multiculturalism, their moral relativism has led them to rush to the defense of theocrats and to abandon the victims of theocracy, and to vilify anyone who calls out this hypocrisy for what it is as a bigot. And to be clear, right, and this is what liberals can't seem to get, is that speaking honestly about the ideas that inspire Islamism and jihadism, beliefs about martyrdom and apostasy and blasphemy and paradise and honor and women, right, is not an expression of hatred for Muslims. It is, in fact, the only way to support the embattled people in the Muslim community, the reformers and the liberals and the secularists and the freethinkers and the gays and the Shia in Sunni majority contexts and Sufis and Ahmadis and as Majid Nawaz puts it, the minorities within the minority who are living under the shadow and sword, rather often, of theocracy. Now, as you know, I've long been worried that political correctness on the topic of Islam would produce a reactionary, nativist, and even fascist backlash in the West. And while I didn't foresee the migrant crisis in Europe or the preposterous candidacy of Donald Trump, the way these events have kindled xenophobia and racism has been totally unsurprising. And this transformation of our country is unfolding with each news cycle. The words we use matter here because in place of conceptual clarity and moral courage, what we are getting from the left is just sanctimony and charges of bigotry against people who are not bigots, who are anything but bigots. And here I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about the millions of people who may yet be tempted to vote for him because their common sense is being demonized and defied at every turn on this issue. And this leaves everyone who is appropriately worried about jihadism and stealth theocracy and the way in which our freedom of speech is already being abridged by the, quote, religious sensitivity of a single community the world over. It leaves these people with nowhere to turn but toward the right, toward their own bullies and even theocrats. And this is happening across Europe, and it is happening in the U.S., and Trump's candidacy is a clear expression of this. And it would be so easy for Clinton to steal the ground from under him by just talking honestly about this. And not only would she be making her candidacy stronger and thereby blocking the path of a dangerous incompetent toward the White House, she would be supporting the very people in the Muslim community who are struggling to do the work of reform. And if you think that speaking honestly about the need for reform within Islam will alienate your allies in the Muslim community, well, then you don't know who your allies are. Okay, well, sorry if that bored you to death, but unfortunately, as I've said before, this is the big story of our time, and it is preempting all the other stories that should be the big stories of our time. All of the other problems in the world that we could be thinking about and trying to solve, all the other creative projects we could be focused on, all the ways in which we might strive to make the world beautiful and a better place to live, all of those things are being preempted by what will almost certainly be a multi-generational effort to contain the religious stupidity and triumphalism of radical Islam. Let's get our terms right, at the very least.